The topic of this unit, crime and deviance, is a popular one in social problems courses, and this is understandable. We're fascinated by crime. We're glued to TV shows like Law and Order. But it's really important to remember that sociologists don't approach the study of crime like detectives. Instead, we take a more critical stance vis-a-vis the U.S. criminal justice system. As Robert Heiner suggests, sociologists don't assume that there's anything inherently bad about crime. Rather, we look at how acts are labeled criminal, who bestows that label and why, and how these labels become institutionalized in the criminal justice. Let's begin with some basics about how we measure crime. We've got Mama's boy here who's going to help out again. A typical measure of crime is what we call the crime rate. And the crime rate is basically the total number of offenses divided by the total population. Crime rates allow us to compare crime across localities with different population sizes. Now, most crime rates come from statistics in what we call the Uniform Crime Report. The Uniform Crime Report is basically a compilation of statistics on crime from law enforcement agencies from around the country that's put together by the FBI. Now, here's what's key about the Uniform Crime Reports. They only include statistics on crimes that have been reported to the police. So it's an imperfect data set. So typically what you'll see is sociologists using the Uniform Crime Report in conjunction with another data set that's collected by the U.S. Department of Justice, known as the National Crime Victimization Survey. And for this survey, a random sample of people from around the country are asked each year to participate in a survey about whether or not they had been the victim of a crime in the previous year. And if so, what were the circumstances of that crime? Now, the key here for the National Crime Victimization Survey is that it includes crimes that are reported to the police and crimes that are not reported to the police. And so in many ways, in conjunction with the Uniform Crime Reports, it helps get a better sense of the prevalence of crime in a particular area. Statistics of crime suggest that crime rates have fluctuated up and down over time. But in recent decades, we've actually seen a decline in most types of street crime. Homicides, for example, declined by 42% in the 1990s, robberies by 40%, and rape and aggravated assault by 20%. But here's what's fascinating. Despite an actual and objective drop in crime rates, the public has become more concerned with crime over the past 2 decades rather than less concerned with crime. Indeed, the perception is that there's a stranger waiting around every corner to mug us or abduct our children. So why the disconnect between the objective decline in crime rates and the growing public concern over crime? Well, according to Heiner, we're more preoccupied with crime today because the media is covering more crime. So what has increased is not actually the rate of crime, but the amount of media coverage that crime gets. Put simply, crime sells, especially violent crime. So the media has an interest in sensationalizing violent crime through TV shows like Cops and the nightly news. As a result, people get a distorted impression that violent crime is on the rise and that it's occurring everywhere we look. Heiner provides some concrete examples of these media-induced crime scares, including the missing children scare, the serial murder scare, and the drug scare. In all 3 of these cases, the media suggested that the crime was more prevalent than it actually was, and that it was more random, or that it could strike anyone, anywhere, at any time than statistics actually suggested. Media reports went so far as to use erroneous statistics to hype the actual crime. So there was the suggestion in the mid-1980s that there were 50,000 abductions of children per year. A more accurate figure was something along the lines of 500. Another example here would be the 1980s war on drugs. Now, although marijuana has been shown to be one of the least addictive and least harmful drugs out there, the war on drugs suggested that marijuana was a gateway drug that would lead to hard drug use and addiction. Now, there were no empirical studies to support this claim, but it made for really good scare tactics. Similarly, the war on drugs emphasized crack cocaine. Now, this was a form of cocaine that is smoked. It tends to be cheaper than powder cocaine, and it was especially prevalent in the 1980s in poor inner city communities. Now, although relatively concentrated in the inner city, the media suggested that crack was all around us and that it was an epidemic taking over American schools. This despite the fact that a survey in the late 1980s, which was the height of the supposed crack epidemic, 96% of high school seniors said that they had never even tried crack. Today, we see coverage of methamphetamine use that is eerily reminiscent of the 1980s war on drugs. So the Frontline special that I asked you to watch on meth use described it as spiraling out of control, a disease sweeping across America. The show featured a map of the United States that charts the spread of meth. So in 1992, the only state in which meth was prevalent was Oregon. By 2003, all states west of the Mississippi on that map indicated the prevalence of meth. The prevalence of meth is likened here to the spread of a disease, an infectious disease like the swine flu. And yet we're never really told what constitutes prevalent. On what basis are we charting the spread of meth here? And is it really spreading throughout these states or in particular communities in these states? The show goes on to suggest that meth use affects long-term brain chemistry, implying that drug treatment probably won't even work. The situation is depicted as hopeless. Now, the article from the Slate magazine that I had you read questions this portrayal of meth use. As the article explains, the first puff from a meth pipe is supposed to cause addiction. Users are depicted as slaves to the drug, the scum of the earth, as ticking time bombs. The use of the drug has reached epidemic proportions, although no one ever defines what epidemic means. So nowhere do we hear the real facts about meth, which are these. Meth use is very dangerous, but it has remained stable since 1999. Its use is relatively isolated and concentrated in particular communities, and meth users respond quite well to treatment. Now, I don't want to suggest that crime or drug use is not a major problem in American society. By all indications, we are among the most violent and crime-ridden societies in the Western world. According to the theorist Robert Merton, Americans are actually prone to crime because we believe so heavily in the American dream, which emphasizes material gain. And yet, our social structure doesn't provide equally legitimate opportunities to obtain that material wealth. As a result, many Americans are tempted to enrich themselves through illicit means. So crime is absolutely deserving of our attention. But the kind of attention that crime deserves is not the kind that we're getting through the mass media. A sophisticated treatment of crime would consider the most prevalent types of crime, which turn out to be property-based, not violent. It would consider also the most prevalent types of drug use, which turns out to be alcohol, not meth or crack cocaine. And it would consider the context in which these crimes take place, which involves poverty and inequality. Why are these sophisticated treatments of crime so few and far between? Well, again, in part it's because sensationalism sells. But according to Heiner, it's also because the elite have an interest in focusing on certain crimes and not others. Far better to focus on crack use among poor people in inner city communities than to shine the light on alcoholism and the use of powder cocaine in wealthy suburbs. Whether you agree with Heiner or not, it's clear that some crimes are considered worse than others, but it's not always the worst crimes that receive the most attention.